We probably should get started so we have plenty of time to take any questions that you all have at the end. I'm going to start. I'm Jacqueline Hand. I'm a professor at University of Detroit Law School, and I sort of want to make a disclaimer. Well, two things: that we noted that we are three non-people of color talking about what's happening in a city that is predominantly African American. We're aware of that. I'm not actually somebody who's doing a lot. My direct, other than growing up on a ranch, my actual exposure now to farming is my scissors for my herbs and my sprouts. So my other two panelists will be able to give you much more of a hands-on, but I want to give you a bit of context with what's happening in Detroit. One of the sort of amazing things is the extent to which Detroit has become sort of the flavor of the month in the last 5 years. Those of us that have been there a long time are sort of bemused by the whole process of what's going on. But talking about urban ag, I want you to visualize a scene that you will see in many parts of the city of nice orderly rows of carrots and cabbages, etc., with high-rise buildings in the background. This comes, and I also want you to keep in mind that many of the visual images that we're going to show and that you will see represents activities that either are currently outside the law or were until very recently outside the law. This was for any number of reasons and in a variety of ways. One of the things is much of the land that's being farmed is owned by somebody else, either by the city because of tax foreclosures or by absentee landowners who are at this point probably holding the land for speculation. Janelle is going to fill you in much more on what that means for what's doing. It also, until quite recently, was in violation of zoning ordinances. So at multiple levels are public health ordinances, and also, and it continues to be the case, that many of these farms, while Detroit is not a desert area, in the summer you need to water crops, and that water tended to be taken from fire hydrants outside the legal activity. So in a sense, these illegalities went on with virtually no enforcement by the city unless somebody in the neighborhood objected. Now, two reasons for that. One is essentially this was socially acceptable behavior. So there was no incentive, and a probably less appealing reason is the city had lots of other things to enforce against, so that unless there was an agitation for it. So that meant you had something very much like, and I don't know how many of you all are historians, gone back and looked at the frontier thesis, but two of the characteristics of the frontier was relatively little legal supervision and the ability of quantities of vacant land, if you want to show the map now. And in fact, that is the case in Detroit. There are, depending upon who figures it, between 20 and 40 square miles of vacant land in the city. The discrepancy is because the first enumeration of that considered vacant land, highways, parks, things that were not really vacant in that sense. And in fact, this map has become somewhat iconic, as you can fit the Manhattan, Boston, and San Francisco in the city without even having to pull the edges around like you're making cookies and roll them out again to fit. Having said that, I think it's important to realize that Detroit is still more dense than many of the Sunbelt cities, at Houston, Phoenix, etc. Part of the we call an anomaly is Detroit wasn't designed or developed as a sort of spread up, essentially suburbanized city. Now, essentially this offers challenges, but it obviously offers opportunities. And essentially part of what's happened is there is a recognition that this land, the opportunity, offers one for ways to deal with the substantial insecurity in the food insecurity of the city that essentially has been talked about, but also a source of entrepreneurial or economic activity. And one of the things that is maybe most noticeable is the number of folks who are not only producing it, but making businesses out of what they're doing. The one that there's not necessarily farmers, but McClure's Pickles has become a national brand, essentially growing out of this entrepreneurial food service sort of process. Now, farming isn't new in Detroit. As in many parts of the country, in the 18th and 19th century, lots of people had gardens, often accompanied by various farm animals. That was essentially considered reasonable. Bigger houses had there many older homes in Detroit that have carriage houses, which are now used as garage, but were carriage houses because that's where you kept your horse. So there is a tradition of that. Now, what happened in this country and in Detroit, like everywhere else, is beginning really at the turn of the last century, people began to want to separate various sorts of uses. So you didn't want commercial and industrial uses close to residential uses, and farming was included in that, so that in Detroit, like most cities, farming activities, I mean, you could have your carrots in the backyard, but you couldn't do any sort of broader agricultural activity, and heaven forbid there be anything other than petunias in your front yard. Had to do with property values, etc. Now, in the meantime, Detroit was experiencing more intensely what was happening in much of the Midwest and Northeast in terms of depopulation, various sorts of issues going on. In fact, depopulation started in the city of Detroit. Its highest population was in 1950, when there were roughly 2 million people within the city. Depopulation, again, that's along with the building of the freeways and all of the things that led to suburbanization. It was intensified with the 1967 riots. So all of a sudden, it became a racial issue, and I'm sure many of you have studied the very unappealing social things that were going on. The end result is that now Detroit has roughly 750,000 people at the last census. There are some indications that that has stabilized and is beginning to come back. There are a number of folks who are trying to use big data to keep a handle on what's happening in the city, and there, for the first time, are coming up with indications that the movement back in. This raises all sorts, potentially, of issues of gentrification, which are extremely interesting and really beyond, to a great extent, what we're doing here. Now, in this meantime, much of the world has written off Detroit. Essentially, it's a wasteland where not much was happening. When I've been going to conferences for 20, 30 years, and when you travel, when you said you came from Detroit, you got this often not explicit, but look on the faces of, oh, I'm so sorry. Unlike folks from San Francisco who just think they're the center of the world. And they live in a perfectly lovely place. But in this meantime, there was, going back before it became trendy, a development towards urban agriculture. You had people expanding their gardens, often into side yards that they might or might not understand that the property, might not own if the property had become vacant. You had the development of community gardens. Again, gradually accelerating over the time, supported by various nonprofits, including organizations like my colleagues here who we're working with. You also, particularly in the last few years, have had the development of these entrepreneurs that I've talked about. From people growing sprouts to people making jam, to collectives, to market. We have probably the most outstanding farmers market of long standing in the country. It's the biggest. It goes back to the 1890s. And in recent years, it has had new management and has become very much a force for and a center for trades of information and support. This comes along with the locavore movement that we're all familiar with. Now, the reason why in Detroit, while all of these things are happening, it remained illegal under zoning was a peculiarity, and I think this is important because given the amount of agricultural activity in the city, still remains illegal, still remains under the radar at a time when many cities all over the country are redoing, looking at it, supporting urban ag. Now, the reason for this is what was Michigan's Right to Farm Act, which these were a series of acts that were passed from about the mid-70s to the mid-1980s, that were intended, as suburbanization had occurred, to protect, if you were an existing farm and all of a sudden a developer bought your neighbor farmer decided to retire and put a subdivision, and everybody thought it was so lovely to be out in the countryside, and then spring came and manure got spread on the fields, and all of a sudden a nuisance suit came. So these were designed to protect rural people who were left there, who were there first from suburbanites with very sensitive nostrils, among other things, and who didn't know. I mean, most of us, as the point was made this morning, we're very far removed from what amounts to agricultural processes. Now, the problem here was that in Michigan, the right to farm law transmortified from a protection for coming to the nuisance by a series of both legislative actions and court decisions to becoming essentially, it was put under the Department of Agriculture's administration and essentially became captured by Big Ag. And I think this fits very much in what was being talked about in the sessions this morning, with the end result that it no longer involved any sort of coming to the nuisance. If somebody moved into your neighborhood and started a nice piggery, if you were selling some bacon, you were completely protected from any sort of nuisance action. You also were protected from local zoning. So essentially there was no mechanism to recognize that all kinds of land use activities exist in context and needed a mechanism to deal with it. So this goes on. The Detroit City Council, which was dysfunctional in many ways, but recognized that if they allowed and approved any side of urban agriculture, they completely lost control of it, and that you could have very serious problems, so they simply dug in their heels and didn't do anything, and mostly didn't enforce. So in this time, you have a lot of people who are, presumably trying to be good neighbors, but who are operating with nobody telling them what to do. Also very characteristic both of American culture and the frontier. So one of the issues that my colleagues are going to talk about is how you make that transition, even though it was one that the folks who were urban farming looked forward to dealing with regulation of setbacks and where you can put your hoop house and all these sorts of things. Now, this was obviously an untenable situation. Finally, under a lot of pressure, the Department of Agriculture changed the regulations, and it's a little more complex than this, but basically exempted cities of over 100,000 population from the Right to Farm Act. So we now have this sort of anomalous situation of cities over 100,000, you're protected. Less than that, then you're back in the no zoning, no any kind of regulation of what's happening with farms, and that's generating some problems. Now, Detroit passed a quite sophisticated right to farm law. Not right to farm, urban agricultural law, benefiting from the experiences of folks without the barrier, so had experience with how zoning worked. They exempted any sort of livestock, chicken, bees, which people get extremely emotional about on both sides of the process, simply because they wanted to work some more to get it in. And livestock ordinance is now very much in process, and Amanda is going to be talking about that as well. So we now have a situation with regulation, with movement coming in, lots of activity in this transition from what is essentially a sort of frontier of people doing what they want, hopefully good sense, but no regulation and often no protections back and forth. So what my remaining two colleagues will talk about is, one, how this transition is working, what the issues are, particularly the whole land acquisition issues, because I think the points that were made in today's presentation are really very key. Ultimately, you can't invest yourself and your energy, your identity, and your future in any kind of activity where you don't have security that 4 years from now you're going to still have that particular piece of land. And then Amanda's going to talk about the particular issues of livestock and how you buffer between the folks that think having chickens next door is not that charming, and the folks who very much see this as part of the whole locavore movement. So I will pass it over to Janelle now.
Thank you. So can you guys hear me if I don't talk right into the microphone? Okay, great, because I want to be able to see my screen. So first I want to introduce myself just so you know who I am and where I'm coming from in talking about the implementation of the ordinance, which, how close do I have to be? All right, I work at Keep Growing Detroit, which is a nonprofit in the city of Detroit, and we support a network of about 1,400 gardens. I didn't make a mistake there. 1,400 gardens in the cities of Detroit, Hamtramck, and Highland Park. Hamtramck and Highland Park are two cities inside of the city of Detroit. That's why we support those three cities. Those are family gardens, school gardens, community gardens, and market gardens. Important distinctions. In Detroit, community gardens look different than what a lot of you probably think of when I say community garden, in that allotment style, you buy your bed and there's other people growing in beds around you. Community gardens in Detroit are one garden collectively tended by a community. Market gardens are how we describe for-profit or profit production-focused gardens. KGD exists to promote a food sovereign Detroit, which we define as the majority of fruits and vegetables Detroiters consume are being grown by residents within the city limits. We do that through our systems change model, which hopefully you guys can read up there. So fostering healthy relationships to food, growing the knowledge of food and farming, cultivating connections to the food community, nurturing leadership skills and capacity. What's the middle one? Changing the value of food and developing food assets. All of that works together because we're not going to get to food sovereignty just by giving people seeds and plants. We're not going to get there just by training people how to organize other people. We're not going to get there just by having our own farm. It is working together and cultivating a community. So Jackie highlighted the actual big picture of the ordinance. I want to talk a little bit about the process of how we got there. Detroit tried, and the push for having an urban agriculture ordinance started with trying to access land. In Detroit, 60% of the vacant property is owned by the city of Detroit or another governmental entity. So there is a city land bank, there is a county land bank, and there is a state land bank that own land in the city of Detroit. The multiple city departments own land in the city of Detroit. And a city can't sell you land for a non-legal land use. So gardeners that have been maintaining lots in their neighborhoods for 5, 10, 15, sometimes 20, 30 years are trying to get ownership. The city can't sell it, and that's where this push for an ordinance came from. I think what's really unique about Detroit is that push for regulation came from the growers themselves. They wanted to be regulated because it gave them validity and standing in what they were doing. It also protected their investments, as we've been hearing about today and yesterday. That growers are putting thousands of dollars and blood, sweat, and tears, literally all of those, into their gardens and farms with no security about what the future holds for them. So the ordinance was led by the Urban Agriculture Work Group, which was a collaborative and collective process that the City Planning Commission put together. There were growers at the table, there were city departments at the table, MDARD, which is the State Department of Ag, was at the table. People proposing really big, crazy ideas to most of us farms were at the table. Everyone was in the room with the goal of consensus building around what does this ordinance look like. That's where dropping animals off at first came from. There was a desire to, they didn't want to push everything through and not get gardens allowed because people were worried about chickens. So we kind of split the process off and put through 15 main uses that were codified. So we, in Detroit, you can have aquaculture, aquaponics, compost, land or construction yards, landscaping yards, farmers markets, farm stands, garden centers, greenhouses, hoop houses, hydroponics, orchards, rainwater catchment systems, tree farms, urban farms, and urban gardens. The vast majority of what's happening fall in the last two, urban gardens and farms. The distinction there is size. If it's under an acre, you're a garden. At an acre, it triggers you to be a farm and triggers another set of review. In Detroit, an acre is roughly a city block. So the idea is if you're under that threshold, you're not significantly changing what your neighborhood looks like, especially if it's primarily empty. If you're at an acre or more, you really could be kind of at the threat of a farm replacing a neighborhood, which is not what the urban ag community wants. It's not what KGD cultivates, and it is certainly not what politicians in the city of Detroit are hoping for. The other great thing about the urban ag ordinance in Detroit is it is not a standalone ordinance. The Urban Ag Work Group and the City Planning Commission went through the entire zoning code, I think it's like 600, 700 pages, and updated every single zone to include some type of agricultural use and to, at the very least, address what is or is not allowed in that zone. That makes it very powerful in its staying power. A lot of cities pass a separate ordinance that is just relevant to agriculture. We updated our entire code. It also makes it a lot easier to make those minor tweaks and adjustments that come when you start to implement it. So we had this very collaborative process led by Catherine Underwood of the City Planning Commission, who I just give a shout out to every time because she is the champion of this. And if she was not in the City Planning Commission, none of this would have happened. If there's one thing that you walk out of here from, if you're trying to do this in your city, is cultivate an ally on the inside. That's the only way this got done. It wasn't a priority by City Council, as Jackie mentioned. They were a mess in 2011 to 13. Much better now. And it was not a priority by then. Catherine pushed and pushed and pushed this and brought growers' issues to the table and inside the city. KGD, myself in particular, has maintained a very good working relationship with Catherine, and that's how we're able to educate about an ordinance. Lots of times policies pass, and then they just sit there and they're on the books. The people they affect know nothing about them, whether they were at the table in making them or not. And then on the other side, also no communication gets back to the city if you don't have that relationship. When growers are not understanding how to interpret one part or another, you get stuck and the city doesn't know, the minutia of what needs to be changed or adjusted. Is everybody with me so far? Okay. So I'm going to go through a couple examples. Some of these, we're calling them procedural hiccups. Some of them are hiccups that have gone away, and some of them are at the point where when you got the hiccups and they start to get painful because you literally just can't figure out how to make them stop. Some of them are at that. So the first one is non-conforming use. So in Detroit, we were also in the situation where we are trying to suddenly regulate 1,400 gardens that have been existing. Not regulate so that things can happen in the future, So we tried to create an ordinance that best as possible legalized everything that was already happening. Now, because people have been doing this on their own, willy-nilly, here, there, everywhere, you couldn't make everybody fit. So you had gardens like Brightmoor, who built this awesome water wall, which if you don't know what a water wall is, it's this water catchment system they built. It's just a wall with, I'm going to totally blank on the word.
Corrugated.
Corrugated, thank you. Roof that runs into a gutter and runs into a big water catchment. Our ordinance says crops and any other garden things have to be set back 5 feet from your property line. The water wall is 4 feet 9 inches from the property line. So they are perfect candidates for non-conforming use because their garden existed before the ordinance went into effect, and they have features that they can't change in order to comply because that is cemented into the ground. Just like if you built a gazebo and you know, or wanted a really sturdy fence, something that's not going to fall down, it's cemented into the ground. So, sounds great, problem solved, they can be non-conforming, except we're still in this environment of non-enforcement and the city having bigger fish to fry, and the garden said, we don't want to pay $200 for our non-conforming use permit and site visit. We'll just risk taking the penalty if, when there ever is one, because it's not worth us, one, to move it now, and it's not worth us to spend that money for, you know, Brightmoor is one of the poorest areas in the city of Detroit. It's not worth it for our garden. That's what, you know, $200 from our garden proceeds pays 3 kids over the summer for a summer job. The trade-offs just aren't there. The second one is change of use. So now we have all these gardens that are legal land use and want to be able to say, I'm a legal land use. Our buildings department has never dealt with land uses that don't have structures. So the change of use permit is our building permit. When we ask BSeed, okay, how do we let you know that gardens are gardens now and they're not vacant lots? They're like, we'll have to get back to you. Our ordinance passed in 2013. We just figured out the change of use permit last year. But through working with Catherine, she was able to connect us to the right people in the city and have those conversations where we could put together an annotated version of the building permit so that growers know if you just want to change your use, only fill out the ones that are highlighted, which with a form that is as complicated as that is extremely, extremely powerful and helpful. Another example is our setback language. I mentioned the 5 feet boundary. It was originally written that could be planted with ground plants. Growers then went, what are ground plants? Everything I put in the ground is a plant. Is that a ground plant? What's the point? One grower in particular is like, so if I plant my setback with lavender and then I just plant everything else inside of that, then I can still use the whole space, right? And I was like, well, I don't know. So we went to Catherine, and Catherine said very much the point of the setback was that it's planted with things not intended to harvest for multiple reasons. One, 5-foot setbacks are required in the rest of our code for fire safety purposes. So that all structures end up being at least 10 feet apart, so if something needs to fit up the middle to put out a fire, it can happen. The other is due to state regulations and federal regulations. The city couldn't say, if you're having a garden or farm, you can't use pesticides, you can't use non-organic fertilizers. They weren't able to regulate that. So by putting a setback in, you're leaving 5 feet essentially for runoff to be captured before it goes into the sewer system, which in Detroit is very important because we have a combined stormwater and sewer system, and it empties into the Detroit River, which is in between Lake Huron and Lake Erie. So it's much bigger than just, oh, something's ending up in the sewer. It could end up in the Great Lakes. So we went to Catherine and said, we got to change this. They added one little clause that just says, ground plants not planted with the intent to harvest. And suddenly you have crystal clear language that just about any grower can understand. Okay, when I'm planting my garden, that means I can't border it in strawberries. It means I can put in anything that can beautify it. I can plant bushes and things that can act as a natural fence, but not anything that I'm planning to harvest. And then the giant hiccup that I was talking about as being so painful has been hoop houses. Hoop houses are regulated in our code as principal uses, and that's great. The hiccup is where they are accessory. If any of you are farmers, you know that you can have a garden and you have lots of in-ground bed production, and then you might have a hoop house where you're growing, or another hoop house. Very rarely is your garden just 5 hoop houses in a row and that's it. In that case, it's an accessory use. What the code and the zoning ordinance didn't understand was that maybe we should incorporate those as an accessory structure. So originally, hoop houses fell as other accessory structure. So growers went to put in their hoop house. They're excited to finally do it above board. And a standard hoop house doesn't fit in the height and setback requirements of an other accessory structure. We worked out that little bit. They updated the code to change the setbacks and make it its own line. However, the building department is insistent that you fill out a building permit, which makes sense. They have their reasons and logistics for that. It's important to know where structures are. However, in Michigan, the state building code, which trumps local law as a home rule state, says structures that are incidental to agriculture don't need building permits. The city doesn't care that the state says that. There's not political or legal power by growers to make the city stand on that. So we have been going around and around and around for 2.5 years now on what do growers actually have to bring to the table to get their building permit. Some BC folks say you need stamped architectural drawings, which cost thousands of dollars. Some BC workers say, as long as you bring me the manufacturer's specs, you're fine, we'll sign it off, it's good. Some of them are like, what's a hoop house?
And so you might explain, there might be somebody here
Yeah.
who doesn't know.
And they don't know a hoop house from an outhouse, is the joke that we sometimes make internally. Does anybody in here not know what a hoop house is? Because I don't want to make fun of you for not knowing what a hoop house is. Valid. A hoop house is a solar passive season extension structure. So generally, it's a bunch of metal poles bent round, covered in plastic. In season extension structures in Michigan are super valuable because they extend our growing season from about 7 to 8 months to almost year-round. So if you're trying to make your living off of a farm, it's a very important component of your farm and business plan. The good news is the state legislature has pending legislation to update it to explicitly say that hoop houses are not allowed, but there's still some folks in BC that probably just won't care. So even though you have an ordinance that is sound and traditionally recognized as the best or one of the best in the country, you can't figure out everything ahead of time. There's going to be hiccups you face as you go through and implement.
I want to back up to your slide.
This one? Oh, sorry. I had clicked it twice. I ruined Amanda's joke. There's going to be hiccups along the way. And as you regulate more, you're going to kind of what we call at KGD is success equals better problems. So now we can have gardens, but what about land access is still a giant, giant issue. I touched on a couple of the highlights of that. The ordinance went into effect in April of 2013. It is now essentially April of 2016. The city, the state land bank, the county land bank, the city land bank, none of them have processes to access land they own for urban agriculture. Urban ag has been legal for 3 years in the city of Detroit, and it's been going on for centuries, and growers still cannot buy publicly owned land. And I could talk for 5 hours about that. The second one is livestock. As we mentioned, we kind of broke it up to get it through in its efficiency. Amanda's going to delve into where things are at there. And we just got a giant update on that, so forgive her if she stumbles through, because lots of things changed since we got to Boston. And the third is water. We live in the Great Lakes state. There is lots of water everywhere, but you can't run water lines to land you don't own. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda, and then we will take questions on everything at the end.
All right, thank you. Before I jump into water and livestock, I want to sort of re-plug both Keep Growing Detroit and then the organization I work for is Michigan Community Resources, not to a very deep extent because I don't want to take up too much time. But if these are topics you're interested in, the websites for both Keep Growing Detroit and Michigan Community Resources, which will be on the last slide, provide extensive information. Michigan Community Resources is a very legal-focused organization, so we have a lot of legal policy manuals published on our website, including our new Greenfield manual, which touches on a lot of urban agriculture. And Keep Growing Detroit just has an amazing amount of resources on what urban agriculture currently looks like in Detroit and what the resources and challenges are. So I wanted to sort of reiterate those plugs. So I'm talking about two different topics that are not actually really connected at all. So there'll be a little bit of non sequitur in the middle of my talk. And I'm going to start out by talking about water and access to water. In 2014, Detroit did something called the Motor City Mapping Project, which was an incredibly extensive project where they sent surveyors out to every single parcel of land in Detroit. And you saw from Jackie's slide, Detroit is big. And these were people that were on foot, and they surveyed literally every parcel in Detroit so they could determine if it was vacant, if it was blighted, if there were structures that needed to be torn down, if it was being maintained. And according to that project, in 2014, there were 114,033 vacant lots in Detroit. Now, vacant lots are kind of prime for urban agriculture, but they don't typically have running water. A lot of the demolition that has taken place in Detroit has not necessarily been what you might call up to code, which means the water lines were often destroyed in the demolition of the buildings, or as Janelle pointed out, even if they were disconnected correctly, you can't ask the city to turn on water to property you don't own. Even if you do own the land, the cost of connecting to the city's water can range from $3,500 to $8,000 just to get the initial connection underway. Your standard community garden doesn't exactly have that budget. So there's, in a lot of cases, these urban farms face the fact that there's no legal method for them to obtain water for irrigation for their farms. And a very common way to address this problem is fire hydrant tapping. Fire hydrant tapping is illegal. And it's illegal for good reason. There are a significant number, I'm not going to be able to find this statistic now, several hundred fire hydrants in Detroit that don't work. The number, I want to say it's 800 and some fire hydrants in Detroit that are dysfunctional. Interestingly, as a city worker pointed out to me, this is actually only 3% of our fire hydrants that don't work. The problem is they're often in sequence. Fire hydrant tapping is often the cause of these hydrants going bad. Fire hydrant tapping for urban agriculture is almost never the cause of the fire hydrants going bad, because if you're using the hydrant to maintain your farm, you're not going to destroy the hydrant in the process. Our city actually allows a permit for fire hydrant tapping for only two things: commercial demolition and residential demolition. Those permits often result in the dysfunction of a fire hydrant. Usually this happens because the hydrant isn't properly closed off and properly drained after it's been used. So either all of the pressure is lost from that particular system, or water is left in the hydrant itself, and this is Boston, you understand winter. When those freeze, it wrecks the hydrant. Fire hydrant tapping is so common in Detroit that there's a special kind of fire hydrant lock that's used across the country referred to as the Detroit lock. There are also a lot of keys to these floating around, I have from anonymous sources. This picture is a fire hydrant that was tapped by Detroit's Water and Sewage Department illegally, except kind of legally because they did it, for the benefit of a restaurant and a cafe that were in a building next to a building that was so blighted that they couldn't fix the water main because they were afraid the other building would collapse. So they just did this very professional fire hydrant tapping job. And you could go to the coffee shop and get your coffee. It's a very popular coffee shop, and this is where your water was coming from to make the coffee. So when we talk about illegal uses being sort of accepted, it can be to kind of an extreme degree. There are several urban farms in Detroit where the local fire departments open the hydrants for the farms. They have sort of a working relationship. Or where these fire departments will fill up the rain catchment systems for the urban farms if they don't get enough rain in a given season. What we're proposing is that perhaps Detroit might benefit from implementing an actual permit for fire hydrant tapping for urban agriculture. It would generate a small amount of revenue for the city, and it would, again, be another step in allowing urban farmers to legitimize what they're doing, because they're not tapping the fire hydrants because it's a cheap and easy way to get water. I mean, it's not like stealing cable. They're tapping the fire hydrants because that is literally the only place that they can really get water. The permits that are in place for the residential and commercial demolition are $370 and $1,390 respectively. Based on some calculations in Cleveland, Ohio, which is kind of a similar demographic to Detroit in this particular category, it would cost approximately $3,000 per acre per year to provide water for an urban farm. That could be broken up into monthly installments, and also recognizing the fact that most of these urban farms are much smaller than an acre. So if you divide it up based on size and issue permits based on size and based on that estimate of $3,000 per acre per year, it's a relatively affordable way to get water. And it takes the urban farmers out of another issue with our water system, which is that our water and sewer systems or water and sewer billing is coupled. So if you happen to own the land and you can get water connected to your property, you also have to pay for sewage, which will nearly double your bill, and you're not using it. A lot of cities have actually dealt with this one water problem because water for urban agriculture is actually not dealt with in most cities in their urban agricultural ordinances. But several cities have at least dealt with uncoupling water from sewage in billing. So that's another possibility Detroit could embrace, but in lieu of that, a permitting process would be relatively simple, and would provide a little bit of revenue for the city and a lot of legitimacy for these urban farms that are still sort of on the forefront of the frontier. So that's kind of the present situation. Urban livestock is the future situation for Detroit. So as both of my colleagues mentioned, originally when Catherine proposed that we have an urban livestock ordinance, urban agriculture ordinance, livestock was going to be included in it. But because of the sort of polarity of that issue, they removed the livestock from it so that they could get the vegetable growing portion through. So that could get out there, and farmers who were growing produce could do that as quickly as possible with the legitimacy that they need. And they held back the livestock ordinance to do more work on it. In my research, as far as I can tell, Detroit has given deeper thought and research to composing the most accurate and all-encompassing urban livestock ordinance of any city in the U.S. There are a lot of U.S. cities, I've lived in a few of them, that have urban agriculture ordinances that are 4 or 5 sentences long, that essentially say you can have up to 5 chickens and no roosters. And that's it. The urban agriculture ordinance in Detroit was based on a very extensive working groups that are still taking place and addresses a lot of issues that are not addressed in some other urban agricultural ordinances. It's very specific on what types of animals can be owned. It's essentially poultry, bees, goats, and sheep.
Rabbits.
Pardon?
Rabbits. Sheep?
Oh, rabbits, yeah.
Oh, when did that happen?
And they do differentiate meat rabbits from pet rabbits. It deals with the different kinds of shelters that have to be provided for each type of animal, the different space allotments, and I mean, it gets detailed on the shelters, not just dimensions, but, you know, chickens have to be provided a certain amount of perch space. This is how you should build the windows. This is how the ventilation should work. This is how the outdoor space should work, and this is how you protect your animals from foxes and owls and that sort of thing. It's incredibly detailed for both the well-being of the animals themselves and the well-being of the neighbors. It deals with manure disposal, which a lot of urban agricultural ordinances do not deal with. And most importantly, at least in my opinion and my experience, is it deals with carcass disposal, both if you're slaughtering meat animals and if you have egg chickens who just die. In a lot of other cities, people end up with animal carcasses that they don't know what to do with because it's illegal to throw an animal carcass in the trash, and it's also illegal to do essentially anything else with it. So Catherine has been incredible in implementing the amount of research and sort of conscientiousness to make a very detailed urban agriculture ordinance or urban livestock ordinance that addresses a lot of these problems. Now, you're never going to please everyone, and I think that that's a struggle that they're having with the urban agriculture ordinance right now. It was supposed to go for a vote this month, but instead of going for a vote, they broke it out into 2 more working groups, essentially people who already have animals in Detroit and people who hate animals. I might be a little biased. People who are opposed to there being any urban agricultural or urban livestock ordinance at all, these 2 working groups. And out of those working groups, they've spun yet more adjustments that they want to make. And I just gathered this information a day or 2 ago, so I hope you don't mind me reading off of my notes. One of the issues that they're thinking about addressing that may or may not be appropriate to be addressed in an ordinance is the number of veterinarians that there are in Detroit. There's one that can deal with these kinds of animals.
As opposed to cats and dogs.
Right.
Yeah.
There's one livestock veterinarian in Detroit. We're also, Catherine came up with a guild concept for our urban agricultural ordinance. This actually came from discussions she had revolving around dogfighting rings. Essentially, where the reason dogfighting rings are so good at staying hidden is because they police themselves. The other dogfighters will say, "Hey, you know, you're getting too open with it, or it's getting, you know, I don't know much about dogfighting. There's too much barking coming from your garage. I don't know." But they police themselves. And so there's a guild attached to this ordinance. Michigan State is creating a Train the Trainer program that the guild will implement. In order to get a permit to have livestock, you have to become part of this guild. And this was one of the main holdups. We couldn't figure out where to house the guild. It needs to be housed in a non-governmental entity because, well, for reasons in Detroit. But it has to be housed with an entity that has the capacity and the sophistication to maintain it and to enforce the usefulness of the guild. As of 2 days ago, I think, the Detroit Food Policy Council has officially announced that they're taking on that responsibility. So it's really wonderful. And hopefully that will remove the final bar for bringing the ordinance up for a vote. And I'm going to stop there. I have lots more notes here about the last 2 working groups, but I think I'm going to stop there so that we can go to the question and answer period. I know you all are just anxious to ask me how you can rent a baby chick for Easter at Eastern Market.
Because you can.
You can. And it's a much better idea than giving someone an animal that they will not take care of. But before we go to questions, I have one final thing I need to mention, which is that lunch will be served in the screening rooms of the movies when we break for lunch. So no need to worry about that. You now know where your food will be, and we can go into questions.
Could I make one addition? Because the reason, again, I'm a little more removed, but why I think the guilds are such a good idea, because they're intended to provide a sort of mediation or arbitration. So if you're next door to somebody whose chicken coop hasn't been cleaned as long as some people's litter boxes for their kitty cats are, you have somebody you can go to short of filing suit, short of going over and punching their lights out. And it seems to me that we'll see how it plays out, but is a really important component that you can function as a community in terms of dealing with these issues.
And the other really important part of the guild is that one of the biggest hurdles when we first started talking about this was Detroit's animal control. And they said, we are already overwhelmed and overstrapped with the amount of dogs. None of us have any experience. We couldn't tell a healthy chicken from an unhealthy chicken. So if we get a complaint called in and we go out, we don't have the knowledge or expertise. And so instead of trying to take on a department that's very contentious in the city of Detroit, because they don't take care of the animals they already confiscate, part of this was how can we remove that from the city so that as we propose this ordinance, we're not also proposing something that needs to be funded by the city, and by a city that has a lot of struggles with revenue generation. How can we put it somewhere that's in a less contentious space? So, question. We'll go 1, 2, 3.
So what you just said about regulation being something that ends up being burdensome for the city or state. I'm from Rhode Island and talking to a lot of farmers about how there's all these like the 1,000 bird exemption. I mean, this isn't urban, totally, but I'm kind of Quebec. Is like the 1,000 bird exemption where you can just slaughter 1,000 birds on your farm legally without having like the whole gamut of USDA inspections, or raw milk, which is illegal in Rhode Island, and then the DEM just says like we categorically don't have adequate capacity to deal with regulating raw milk. And I wonder like if you have any experience with having any, like it sounds like the guild is a good opportunity to be like, we'll self-regulate, but I'm really curious about other creative ways of being like, well, in New Hampshire where they don't believe in laws, like you have raw milk and it's not regulated, and so like that's what like a lot of farmers say. But like, are there other ways that you can talk about
How unique is our
regulation,
cottage food law?
or how do you deal
How
with
unique
the
is
fact
our
that when
cottage
you
food
introduce
law?
more activity, economic activity, there's more regulation, or like that's the argument that you get pushed back is Providence's growth too.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about the cottage food law.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the best example, and I don't know all about it.
Does Rhode Island have a cottage food law?
I don't think so.
So Michigan has, and I don't know when it was passed, but I used to work for Eastern Market, which is the market Jackie was talking about, and it is the largest, historically, the largest and oldest continuously operating historic public market in the U.S. It is a 5-city block farmers market that runs year-round, and it really is quite incredible. It was the first official food hub named by the USDA. But there is, and because of this being located in Michigan, there's an intense food entrepreneurism movement, which was at odds with food regulation in certain places. So Michigan has a cottage food law, which is actually quite simple. I'm going to oversimplify it now to not take up a lot of time, but the cottage food essentially says, if you want to make food in your own kitchen, in a sort of an unregulated environment, here are the foods you can make, here are the foods you cannot make, and here is the statement that you have to put on your packaging, and there's also some packaging regulations. But it's essentially the lowest level of regulation that they could put on starting out food businesses.
And there's is there quantity also?
It's,
There's like a threshold over.
there's a threshold of profits. I think it's $25,000. You cannot make more than $25,000 in a year. And if you do, then you automatically have to step up to the regular state regulation.
Isn't the market also working to develop kitchens that if you want to sell jam, you can come in and use it for 3
Yeah,
days?
so that's
to make that the sort of transition between the,
Yeah.
your little 4-burner stove and a big factory type
Yeah,
situation.
there's a great organization in Detroit called Detroit Food Lab, and under them, they run a program called Detroit Kitchen Connect. And essentially what they do. Okay, well, now they're separate. It started under Detroit Kitchen Connect. Things change all the time. And essentially what they do is they've gone out and found all the commercial kitchens that exist around the city, in churches, in schools, that are used for very small periods of time. They have, if they're not licensed how they need to be, it's simple to get them up to code. And they're connecting them with food entrepreneurs that are kind of hitting that threshold or are, making something that's in the, you can't make this under the Cottage Food Law Act, and renting out kitchen space. So you're suddenly creating a revenue stream for people that own commercial kitchens that don't use them for lots of periods of the day or week or month or year, and providing a space for food entrepreneurs who want to get their product out and scale up their production or don't fall under the Cottage Food Law to be able to do that, and making matches that has really seen the food entrepreneur, the value added market in Detroit explode and take off in the last 3 years.
It has.
And I think that's a great example of, it's a food entrepreneurs were coming together to say, this is the biggest problem we're facing. How can we solve it? And kind of solved it within the regulations that exist, and then now are collectively pushing towards changing policies that, inhibit the kind of smaller scale production. Detroit Kitchen Connect.
Which is affiliated with Eastern Market, and you can probably reach it by going to easternmarket.com.
Yeah.
So my question is about the setbacks and the plantings there. Did they put a height limit so that fire departments could run hose? Did they say a non-harvestable plant that's less than 18 inches, or did they just, because bushes would be tall?
Right. So we haven't come into this, actually had people ask about it. There's only regulations on corner lots, which are site purposes for cars and pedestrians. Not so much on there. I imagine if we start getting people planting, rows of 5-foot trees, that might be another hiccup we encounter. But right now, people are mostly just keeping that setback grass, because they're starting, the lot they start with is full of grass. They take it out where they're growing, they put in a wood chip path, and then they plant their beds, essentially. So most folks are keeping it, the grass that's already there, or ornamental grasses. But there are regulations on corners for site reasons.
With a height?
Yeah, height regulations, yeah. I don't know what they are offhand. You were questioning?
So, going back to the land access issue, what steps are being made in Detroit to look at developing either land trusts or working in conjunction with existing community development organizations? And the reason I ask that, in Boston, there's an urban farming institute, and what they've been able to do, but very, gradually, is partnering with one of the community development organizations. So the land goes through a series of steps, and the city is willing to, sell the land for $1 to a known community development organization that works within a particular neighborhood. So has that happened? Because I know the land
Yes and no.
access, land tenure is the biggest.
Yeah.
Detroit used to have a program like that. I think it was called SAVE. It doesn't exist anymore. It was almost identical to what you just said. It kind of fell apart during the same period of time when a lot of city processes fell apart essentially before the bankruptcy when city employees were being drastically cut and there just weren't people there to run the program anymore. The organization that I work for, Michigan Community Resources, does an incredible amount of work with vacant land, and we are actually just in the infant stages of pursuing policy work in creating essentially a right of first refusal process for nonprofit organizations and community organizations to be able to obtain land. So I'm going to give a real brief, oversimplified sort of view of what our tax foreclosure auction market looks like. So there's 2 stages. A property goes into tax foreclosure in Detroit, which is like a lot of properties all the time, constantly going into tax foreclosure in Detroit.
40,000 this year, I think, projected.
So they go to tax foreclosure. At the first auction, you have to pay the taxes. So if it's in foreclosure for $50,000 in taxes, which is a pretty average number, and they go up much higher than that. But if the property is in foreclosure for $50,000 of taxes, you can walk away with that property for $50,000. Most of these properties are not worth that much. So if it goes through the first auction and it doesn't get sold, it goes to the second auction, which is just a straight up
$500.
yeah, $500 minimum, but there are 2 complications. One is bundling. They've started this new process it's got its pros and cons, and I won't go into detail, but essentially they're bundling things, and it's supposed to make it easier for people to obtain property. It's supposed to make it better for development, but as you can probably guess, it makes it a little harder for individuals who just want to buy their garden plot if it gets sucked up into one of these bundles. Additionally, you have speculators coming into these sales. So if you have a person who just wants to buy their one garden lot, they're competing against speculators. There's an incredible amount of property in Detroit that is now owned by people in China. And our farmers are facing competition against these individuals. So we're working on a process where both the city and the county, and which one in which case is sort of complicated, but both the city and the county would exercise their right of first refusal on behalf of qualifying community organizations so that those community organizations could get to the property after the first auction, but before the second. And since it's after the first auction, the taxes would have been written off by that point. So they could get the property for an affordable price, and they would not be in competition against the speculators.
Yeah.
So where's that? Is that about to happen?
It's in its infancy.
Another similar program is the Detroit Land Bank. So our city land bank has greatly increased its capacity recently, primarily to do demolitions or blight removal, but they also they concentrated the land holding into the city land bank. So the county land bank and the state land bank transferred their city of Detroit properties to the city land bank, and the planning and development department of the city transferred most of their residential properties to the Detroit land bank. And they have 2 programs, which are great programs, but they kind of don't hit all the gaps. They're selling side lots, so a vacant lot adjacent to a residential structure for $100, which is great if you've been taking care of the empty lot next to your house for a couple decades. Or they will sell to community partners, so 501c3 organizations that have target geographic areas less than 5 square miles. Those entities are allowed to buy vacant structures and vacant parcels to do with it as they will. What that kind of leaves in the lurch are those community groups that don't have 501c3 and don't need 501c3, like block clubs, and for-profit growers who are not 501c3s, don't ever want to be 501c3s. So there are folks doing kind of that workaround, going to their neighborhood community partner, saying, hey, I want to buy these lots. Then the community partner puts in their application, and then because it's so many lots, if you buy more than 10, it has to go back to city council for approval. And so, they're going through this process, and we're working, KGD and growers and other organizations are working. KGD just got approved to be a community partner, and we're one of only like 4 or 5 that didn't have to define a geographic area. We made the argument that because we're a specialty organization and we're serving like a niche market, we shouldn't have to do that. to buy land on behalf of those kind of in-between folks. There's avenues to buy vacant land for economic development. We haven't quite had the conversations yet with the economic development folks to make the pitch of urban ag as economic development. I don't think it's going to go well, but we're going to try.
And I don't know if you've run into this in your organizations, but in one of the challenges that we've been finding is when you get to that city council point, everyone's getting turned down because it's not in the plan. There's a mysterious plan. We have a lot of plans. Detroit has master plans every 10 years. We have a lot of master plans. But there's currently apparently a plan that no one actually knows about.
Yep. Or it's because there's not a plan. So we're about to get a new master plan, and the land bank doesn't want to sell off vacant land because the almighty developer might come save us when we have a master plan. And heaven forbid we sell 2 lots to a grower so they can keep having their for-profit or community garden, and somebody wants to put an apartment building on it in 5 years.
Right. We only have time for one more question.
And I want to make one statement
yeah.
before I finish. That just before we have time, we've been making, and I certainly have been making sort of mildly snarky comments about, and the bureaucracies and many ways the powers that be in Detroit have been very dysfunctional. Having said that, I want to make clear that it's a wonderful city. But the thing is, the residual, the grit, the hang in there. I'm sorry. I've lived there for 30 years. It's so nice to see it getting better. This is silly. But I want you to recognize that there is a core value there. My kid that's living in Washington, D.C. can't wait to try to find a job to come home. So put this in the context of it's a city that can generate organizations and these sorts of things. So certainly take away, the powers that be can do all sorts of damage everywhere, and they sort of came together in perfect storms in the city. But it's not just that it's coming back at its worst. It was a wonderful, resilient community. So, end of tirade.
One question.
You've been waiting very patiently.
Sorry, I'm actually from Detroit, so
Yeah.
Great.
it's really important to me. I'm a law student now, and I'm planning on going back to Detroit, but I think this applies to like anybody who's maybe in law hoping to like go back to a city where they want. I'm just wondering what your suggestions as like how maybe people could use their law degree to help empower and legitimize the people who need the help.
Go work for Amanda.
Yeah.
There's also a gentleman named Nick Leonard, who you in particular should look up and connect with, who's doing a fellowship solely based around providing legal support to urban ag people, and kind of the full gamut of law. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but entity formation. How do you be a co-op under Michigan law versus a collective versus an LLC versus an L3C, LLC3, whichever one it is, which is a social-driven, for-profit organization. How do you manage employees versus volunteers? How do you acquire property? How do you fight blight tickets when you didn't fill out your change of use permit? There's all of that, and I think the more and more urban ag is legitimized in zoning codes and other laws, the more and more need there will be for lawyers to support that movement, whether it's for profit or, as a pro bono piece of your work.
I was going to say, one of the other things that Amanda's organization does is, let's say you need to take a regular law job, to eat. But she connects up, the very large firms have organized pro bono programs, but one of the things her organization does is connect you if you want to do pro bono as part of your work for, say, a particular nonprofit, which I just found out they were doing that, and I think it's extraordinary because often it's really hard to figure out if you can't take on major litigation, what can you do to contribute as part of your professional life. Because I also teach environmental law, and there are relatively few purely do-gooder jobs out there. But there are ways to negotiate that.
And that's essentially what I was going to say.
Well, I should have left it
In
to you.
food,
I'm
no.
sorry.
In food law, you face the same struggle that you do in so many other areas of public service law. There's no money. So you either have to find a stable nonprofit organization that you can work for, so you can get enough food to feed your family while you're doing this work, or you have to find a way that you can do the work sort of on a volunteer basis. For food law specifically, it's very much a matter of learning about property and about policy, and also the layering of policy that goes on from city to county to township to state to national level, and even occasionally international level. But really, it's a matter of sort of combining the for-profit with the nonprofit in a way that sort of moves the entire picture forward. And if anyone wants to do pro bono work for nonprofits in Michigan, I am the person to talk to. The state, my organization is literally the state bar recognized only organization that officially connects nonprofits with pro bono partners. And I am the person who runs the program. So really, if you want to do nonprofit work in Michigan, that's my email address. You email me and I'll find you someone. We've got plenty of candidates. Thank you all so much.
I think we're out of time.